Welcome to Tales from the Training Room, Burkett's bite-sized podcast series from the Shaping Excellence team. In this episode, Sonya O'Reilly and Lorna Townsend provide some handy tips around how best to manage an investigation happening in your workplace. Sonya O'Reilly is a partner in our employment team and regularly provides advice to employers and executives on the issues that may arise out of an employment relationship. Lorna Townsend heads up our investigations team as a consultant and has extensive experience of dealing with complex and sensitive investigations, often involving allegations of discrimination. They begin their discussion by looking at the history of investigations and how they are reported by mainstream media.
I guess the backdrop to our conversation and the context for it is the fact that we're seeing such an explosion of investigations hitting the headlines, aren't we? So we've had Dominic Raab and the bullying allegations that have been investigated recently, and London Fire Brigade allegations of systematic racism.
Yeah, absolutely. Partygate,
yes.
Which of course everybody was talking about. So I don't have to explain what I do to people. People sometimes have difficulty understanding what I do as an investigator. Now I just say, well, Partygate, Sue Gray, that's the sort of thing that we do.
Yeah, which is so interesting, and I think it's still such a topical issue, and it's one that I know from practicing with employment law issues and advising clients on disciplinary issues and grievance issues. Investigations are front and centre of that, aren't they? So are those the main kind of investigations that you get involved in?
Yeah, I mean, we do anything and everything, but I would say that by and large they tend to be allegations of bullying, sometimes harassment, sometimes discrimination. Those are the main sorts of things, but also all sorts of other misconduct, whether it's an allegation that somebody's committed fraud. So there's no real limit to what we can investigate.
What we've seen since COVID, I would say, is an increase in grievances being raised by people, because I think COVID really highlighted or brought to the forefront of people's minds difficulties that they were having at work that they perhaps had suppressed. Yeah. People have had a changed direction after COVID, I think, or a changed emphasis of what's important to them and what they will put up with and perhaps what they might be less inclined to put up with. So I think we've certainly seen more workplace difficulties.
Right.
I don't think that's in relation perhaps to the press bringing these things to the fore more. I think the things like Me Too campaign, the Black Lives Matter movement, of course, have an impact. But I think it's actually almost a post-COVID effect of people struggling with all sorts of different issues, perhaps.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, I don't have any evidence of this, but for example, the investigations into cabinet ministers allegedly bullying colleagues, particularly when the finding is that has taken place, and Dominic Raab, for example, having to resign over it, I think that must provide encouragement to some individuals thinking, well, actually, it is worth raising these matters because it can result in
change.
In change, yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think that it must be encouraging to people to think that even at the highest levels of organisations across the country, people are being called out, perhaps where there are behaviours that are perhaps not. The CBI, of course, in the press recently as well, with the allegations against the chair of the CBI. So I think those sorts of things are going to be making it certainly more in the forefront of people's minds. Yeah. And, why do you see that investigations are so important, or a good investigation is so important?
Okay. Well, and I think organisations are recognising this increasingly, that they are absolutely key to a fair process going forward. So if you start off with a poor investigation, you often end up with a poor disciplinary hearing. and you reduce your chances of being successful in the event that you end up in an employment tribunal. So if
it's like the good foundation almost, isn't it? Your
absolute,
building blocks are right.
Yeah, then it's the cornerstone to it. And so if an organisation is dismissing somebody, and there's been an investigation followed by a disciplinary hearing, and it ends up in tribunal, the tribunal will expect to see a reasonable investigation, and if it doesn't meet that test, then you're potentially in difficulty.
Yeah, and that's where, when it comes across my desk at the point when it is a tribunal claim, it can be so difficult to defend a case which has got a poor investigation as its foundations. And
that's right.
The flip side is also true. It really, really helps to be able to mount a good defence for the employer, if I'm acting for the employer, if that's been done well.
Yeah. And can help to even avoid it in the first place. If you start out with a good process and a good investigation, you're much more likely, I think, to be able to resolve matters without it actually ending up in tribunal.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, if you're thinking about things that you see that goes well, or what the challenges are really to a good investigation, what would you say are those key challenges?
Well, I would say the absolute first crucial point of any investigation is getting the right person to do it, which sometimes is easier said than done. And not only do you need the right person doing it with the right skills and the right qualities, I would say, which is something I'll come on to, you need that person to have the time to commit to it. And obviously there are some investigations that don't take up quite so much time, but the ones we tend to become involved with can take weeks, if not months, because they involve multiple witnesses, sometimes lots of documentation. So it is those types of investigations, it would be very difficult for somebody internally to deal with it alongside their day job, which is also important.
Yes.
But in terms of getting the right person, you want someone who inspires confidence. You're often talking to people who are distressed, upset, either because they have a grievance or someone who's had an allegation raised against them. You're dealing with all those emotions. So you need somebody with good, active listening skills, empathy, the ability to ask the right questions, to analyse the evidence. Is quite a big ask of somebody, particularly for the more complex investigations.
Yeah, and I think that probably sort of brings us on to thinking about the kind of people that we at Burkitt's use as part of our investigation service, doesn't it? Who do we use? You're obviously one of our investigators heading up the team, but
yeah, we only use qualified lawyers with an employment law background, and that experience of dealing with tribunal claims, dealing with bundles, dealing with evidence, understanding the law. I mean, if you're looking at a claim of race discrimination or sex discrimination, for example, you need to understand the legal basis for that. And then, of course, there's the drafting skills as well, which I think sometimes are underestimated. It's one thing doing the investigation, questioning people, but actually setting that out into a well-drafted, clear, comprehensive report can be quite challenging. And so we formed the view that all our investigators would have that background and that experience, and I think that works really, really well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it is, I mean, it's not to say that other people can't do good investigations, but I think particularly on those very large investigations that we get involved in,
no, absolutely,
very, very complex.
And it doesn't mean that every employment lawyer is going to be a good investigator either.
Different set of skills.
Absolutely,
yeah.
Overstepping the mark can be particularly problematic, and one thing the investigator shouldn't be doing is suggesting a possible sanction, because that is not the role of the investigator to say, for example, whether that person is guilty of gross misconduct, just by way of example.
That's the disciplining officer's job, isn't
That's
it, at
right.
that stage?
Yes, and usually with grievances, normally our reports, we're not actually determining the outcome, it's then being handed over to somebody else. The report will be influential, but we're not determining the outcome to it. But conversely, I think some investigators are too fearful of actually making findings. They sort of view it as a fact-finding exercise, which is fine, and it is. But it's about a bit more than that, and sometimes you're exercising a judgment, you're listening to evidence from different people, and sometimes it's necessary to actually make a finding as to whose evidence you prefer, and provided you set out the reasons as to why you prefer one person's evidence over another's, that's absolutely fine. And I think sometimes clients find it a bit frustrating when the investigator has spent all those weeks on something, but they don't then actually make any findings at the end of it.
Which then means that it's down to the person who receives that report to actually try to analyse it themselves and actually will do the job again.
That's
that
right.
An investigator might otherwise have done. So is that balance really between finding the sort of sweet spot somewhere in the middle, making findings and analysing.
That's right. And again, it's that, I talked about judgment earlier. It's judgment, confidence, and experienced investigators, I think, have a natural feel for where that right point lies.
Yes, that's interesting. And some of the other challenges or the things that often come up when I'm advising employer clients about investigations can be things about recording of those investigatory meetings and things. Is that something that you come across as well?
Yeah, I mean, that's the question that's often asked. So how do we get a decent note from our witness investigation meetings, which is obviously absolutely crucial that you've got a good record of what people have said. And it's my experience, and it's my practice to record all my investigation meetings subject to the consent of the individual, which actually is very rarely denied. Most people are fairly comfortable. You just explain to them, you get their consent, you explain what will happen to the recording. They're then provided with the transcript. They have the opportunity to comment on it if they think something's been mistranscribed. And we have very good transcribers, because that's another potential pitfall. People who type up transcript, it's a massive job to get it right. It's very easy to type down something inaccurately. So I think that's the best way, because otherwise you are, if you're trying to take a note yourself whilst listening, you can't. You either don't listen properly or you don't get a decent note, or both. And if you've got someone else sitting in the room, they can't get it all down, but it's difficult for them to exercise a judgment as to which bits need to be got down. So I think recording is absolutely the best way, and that works pretty well for us.
Yeah. Are there any other things at all that you think are key to a really good investigation, and or to the ability to ruin an investigation as well? Things that you've seen that can go wrong.
I think the things that go wrong commonly, I would say, are where the right people aren't interviewed, and I think it's this question of judgment call. One of the kind of qualities that I think you need in a good investigator is somebody with good common sense and sound judgment, because it isn't always necessarily immediately obvious who you need to speak to, what documents you need to see. But if you miss out a key person, or you miss out some key questions, then that can impact on the end result and mean that your investigation report is open to challenge. So I think that's one of the big problems. Yeah.
So I think then in summary, really, this is a growing area of work for all organisations, I think, where there's more grievances being raised. Actually, on the back of the Me Too campaign, we're seeing an awful lot more women in that situation with sexual harassment allegations, bringing those issues forward in a way that they perhaps didn't feel comfortable doing before, which will only mean that there are more investigations which can become more and more complex over time to really look into.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things, actually, going back to a question you asked earlier, one of the things that's really important you get so a lot of what we investigate are grievances, and the key issue there is to meet with the individual who's raising the grievance to make sure you've understood it, and we always then document it, get them to approve it, so that we then have a document setting out their grievance that person is happy with.
Yeah, well, I think it's been a useful chat actually to sort of tease out some of those issues that come up, and I think it's one of those areas, Lorna, where I'm sure if anybody listening would want to get some more information or just have an investigation that they're embarking upon and need some guidance, that you would be very happy to.
Yes, absolutely.
Chat.
We're always happy to have a no obligations chat about what might be involved and what the potential costs might be, because although of course there is a cost from instructing somebody externally, you're not taking your important colleagues away from their day jobs, and you get all the other benefits that come with having somebody with all that experience.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you.
That was Sonya O'Reilly and Lorna Townsend discussing how best to manage investigations. If you found this episode of Tales from the Training Room useful, our Shaping Excellence team has a whole host of employment training courses available. Our training is practical, insightful, and always provided by the best legal professionals. Head to our Shaping Excellence training page at burkitts.co.uk to find out more. This podcast has been produced by Burkitts. The content of this podcast is for general information only. It is not and should not be taken as legal advice. If you require any further information in relation to this podcast, please contact us in the first instance via our website, burkitts.co.uk.